The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people shift in their seats and clear their throats just to break the silence. The doors at the back swung open, and in walked a woman who carried herself like someone who had faced storms and walked through fire without flinching. Her name was General Ava Coleman. She wasn't just any general. She was the first Black woman in history to become a 4-star general in the U.S. Army. That meant she was one of the highest-ranking soldiers in the entire country, a leader who had spent her life protecting others. Her uniform was crisp, decorated with rows of medals, each one telling a story of bravery. But one medal stood out more than the others. It was the Distinguished Service Cross, the second-highest award for courage in combat. She had earned it years ago, during a mission gone wrong. It happened in a war zone, deep in enemy territory. Her platoon, her soldiers, had been ambushed. Bullets flew from all directions. Explosions rocked the ground. Most people would have frozen. Some might have run. But not Ava. She fought back. She dragged wounded soldiers to safety. She called in air support. She stood her ground until every last one of her team was out of danger. Because of her, they all made it home alive. That was the kind of leader she was. The kind who didn't just give orders but led from the front. The kind who earned respect not by demanding it, but by proving, again and again, that she was willing to sacrifice everything for those under her command. Now, years later, she walked into a different kind of battlefield, a civilian courtroom. She had been called to testify in a big case about military contracts. It wasn't a war zone, but in some ways, it was just as dangerous. People whispered as she passed. Reporters snapped pictures. She ignored them all. She had faced worse. But what happened next no one saw coming. Not even her. The judge, an older man with a sharp face and cold eyes, watched her as she approached the witness stand. She stood tall, her medals gleaming under the courtroom lights. Then the judge spoke. And with just a few words, everything changed. The courtroom felt colder now. General Ava Coleman stood perfectly still in front of the witness stand, her polished boots barely making a sound against the wooden floor. Every eye in the room was locked onto her. Reporters stopped scribbling in their notepads. Lawyers paused their whispered conversations. Even the bored-looking jury members sat up straighter. Ava had testified in courts before. She knew the routine. Stand straight. Speak clearly. Tell the truth. But something about this judge made the air feel heavy. He was an older man, with thin gray hair and deep lines on his face that looked like they had been carved by years of frowning. His black robe swallowed his shoulders, making him seem larger than he really was. When he looked at her, his eyes were like 2 chips of ice. "General Coleman," the judge said. His voice was quiet but sharp, like a knife cutting through paper. "You will remove that medal before testifying in my courtroom." For a moment, Ava wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. The words didn't make sense at first. Remove her medal? The Distinguished Service Cross? The one she had received directly from the president in a ceremony with cameras flashing and soldiers saluting? The one she had bled for? A stunned silence crashed over the courtroom. Somewhere in the back, a woman gasped. A man coughed nervously. Ava could feel the eyes of every person in the room burning into her. "Your Honor," Ava said, keeping her voice steady. She had faced enemy gunfire, without flinching. She would not let her voice shake now. The judge leaned forward slightly, his fingers lacing together on top of his desk. "That decoration is a distraction," he said, as calmly as if he were commenting on the weather. "This is a court of law, not a military parade." Ava's jaw tightened. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. The medal wasn't just a piece of metal pinned to her uniform. It was a story. It was the screams of her soldiers in that ambush. It was the smell of smoke and blood in the air. It was the weight of the rifle in her hands as she fought to get her team out alive. It was the president's handshake, the tears in her mother's eyes when she came home. And this man wanted her to take it off, as if it were nothing? As if it were some cheap piece of jewelry instead of proof that she had stared death in the face and won? The courtroom waited. The air was so thick with tension that it felt hard to breathe. The judge stared at her, unmoving. The bailiff shifted on his feet, unsure what to do. The lawyers at their tables had frozen, some with their pens hovering over legal pads, others with their mouths slightly open. Ava had a choice. She could obey. She could reach up, unpin the medal, and set it aside. She could swallow her pride and move forward. It would be the easy thing to do, the safe thing, or she could stand her ground. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard the voice of her first drill sergeant from basic training, barking at her all those years ago. Asterisk. You don't earn respect by bowing your head, Coleman. You earn it by holding it high. Asterisk. The silence stretched. Then, General Ava Coleman made her decision. The courtroom clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed the judge's command. Each passing second stretched longer than the last as General Ava Coleman stood perfectly still at the witness stand. The air smelled faintly of old books and wood polish, mixed with the nervous sweat of people holding their breath. Ava could feel the weight of the Distinguished Service Cross against her chest. It wasn't heavy physically, but what it represented pressed down on her like an invisible force. She remembered the exact moment it had been pinned to her uniform, the way the sunlight had reflected off its surface as the president shook her hand, how her fellow soldiers had stood at attention with proud smiles, how her mother had wiped tears from her cheeks in the audience. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Ava said, her voice calm but firm like steel wrapped in velvet, "this medal was awarded for acts of courage under fire." She paused, making sure each word landed with perfect clarity. "It is part of my official uniform, and I will not remove it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom like a wave. Someone dropped a pen. It clattered against the floor, the sound shockingly loud in the tense silence. The judge's face turned a deep, blotchy red, as if someone had poured hot water over his skin. The veins in his neck stood out like ropes. His fingers, which had been resting calmly on the bench a moment before, now curled into tight fists. "General," he said through clenched teeth, the word coming out sharp and dangerous, "you are in contempt of court." He turned his head slightly toward the bailiff. "Escort her out." The bailiff, a large man with a nervous expression, hesitated for just a second before moving forward. His shoes squeaked against the polished floor as he approached Ava. The sound seemed to break some invisible spell in the room. Suddenly, the courtroom erupted. Gasps and shouts filled the air. Reporters scrambled for their cameras, the rapid clicking of shutters sounding like machine gun fire. One woman in the front row actually stood up, her hand covering her mouth in shock. A lawyer at the defense table half rose from his seat before thinking better of it and sitting back down. Ava didn't resist as the bailiff took her arm. She held her head high, her back straight as a rifle barrel, as she was led away from the stand. But her eyes never left the judge's face. There was no anger in her gaze, no hatred, just a quiet, unshakable certainty that she was right. As she walked down the center aisle, people leaned out to try to touch her uniform. An older black man in a suit reached out and gently brushed his fingers against her sleeve as she passed, his eyes shining with something between pride and sorrow. A young law student, her face pale with shock, pressed both hands to her chest as if her heart might burst out. Outside the courtroom doors, the hallway was chaos. More reporters surged forward, shouting questions that blended together into a wall of noise. Camera flashes exploded like miniature fireworks, temporarily blinding her. Someone jostled against the bailiff, and for a moment Ava thought the crowd might actually rush her. But through it all, Ava kept walking, step by step, head high, shoulders back, the medal still gleaming on her chest. Back in the courtroom, the judge was pounding his gavel, his shouts barely audible over the noise. "Order! I will have order in this court." But the damage was already done. By the time Ava reached the courthouse steps, the first videos were being uploaded to the internet. Within an hour, the clip would be seen by thousands. By lunchtime, millions. By evening, the entire country would be talking about the general who refused to remove her medal. But right now, standing in the bright sunlight outside the courthouse, Ava only thought about one thing: the soldiers she had served with. The men and women who had fought beside her. The ones who had lived because of her decisions, and the ones who hadn't. She touched her medal one last time, then turned to face the cameras. The storm began before General Ava Coleman even reached her car outside the courthouse. As her driver navigated through the shouting reporters and flashing cameras, her phone buzzed constantly in her pocket. By the time they turned onto the highway, the world had already begun reacting to what happened in that courtroom. At first, the responses came like raindrops before a hurricane. A tweet here. A news alert there. Then the floodgates opened. The military responded fastest. Before sunset that same day, a Pentagon spokesperson stood before a forest of microphones at a hastily arranged press conference. The woman's uniform was perfectly pressed, her face carefully blank as she read from prepared notes. "While we respect General Coleman's service," she said in a voice that didn't sound very respectful at all, her actions today showed poor judgment. "Respect for the judiciary is paramount in our democracy." Ava watched the clip on her phone while sitting at her kitchen table. The words stung, but what hurt more was who wasn't speaking. None of her fellow generals called. None of the young officers she'd mentored over the years reached out. The silence from the military community was louder than any press statement. On television, the talking heads were already arguing about her. The conservative news channels showed pictures of Ava looking angry, though she hadn't been angry, just determined, with words like arrogant and above the law flashing in big red letters under her face. One commentator even said, "If she can't follow a simple order from a judge, how can we trust she followed orders in combat?" The liberal news stations tried to defend her, but their words came out weak and wobbly. "While we understand the general's feelings," one anchor said, sounding like he didn't understand at all, "there are proper ways to protest." Another added, as if standing silently with your medals was some kind of wild rebellion. Most crushing of all was the White House's silence. The president, who had once hugged Ava after presenting her with an award, said nothing. Not a word. Not even a simple, "We're looking into the matter." Just silence. Then came the hammer blow. 3 days after the courtroom incident, an official notice arrived at Ava's home. The Army was initiating an administrative review of her service record. The dry, official language couldn't hide what this really was, a fishing expedition to find anything they could use against her. Like ghosts rising from graves, old accusations suddenly came back to life. That time in Iraq when she'd supposedly been too harsh with a subordinate. The mission in Afghanistan where some paperwork had gone missing. Complaints from years ago that had been investigated and dismissed at the time now took on new importance. But in the court of public opinion, none of that seemed to matter anymore. The narrative had been set. Ava Coleman wasn't a hero anymore. She was a problem. And the military, the government, even her so-called allies, they all knew how to deal with problems. They made them go away. Ava sat in her study, surrounded by boxes of military records she'd kept meticulously over the years. Photographs of her with soldiers she'd served with covered the walls. Each face told a story. Many of those soldiers had written letters supporting her over the years. Would they still stand by her now? Would they be allowed to? The worst part wasn't the attacks from strangers. It was the quiet desertion of people she'd thought were friends. The invitations to speak at events that got postponed. The calls that suddenly weren't returned. The way some of her former colleagues would quickly change the subject when her name came up at gatherings. At night, lying awake in bed, Ava would sometimes reach for her Distinguished Service Cross, which she now kept on her nightstand. Running her fingers over its cool surface, she'd think about the soldiers whose names weren't in the news, the ones who had served with her in the worst moments. They knew the truth. They knew what the medal really meant. The early morning light filtered through the blinds of General Ava Coleman's Pentagon office, casting long shadows across the nearly empty room. Boxes lined the walls, filled with 28 years of service photographs, commendations, dog-eared manuals, and the small personal treasures that had made this sterile space feel like home. Ava moved slowly between the shelves, her fingers brushing against each item as if trying to memorize them by touch. The brass nameplate that had once proudly declared General Ava Coleman now sat in a cardboard box, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. The Distinguished Service Cross, that same medal that had started all this trouble, lay in its velvet case beside it. Ava paused, lifting the case and running her thumb across the embossed surface. How strange that something so small could carry so much meaning and cause so much damage. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Enter," she called, slipping the metal case into her pocket out of habit. The door opened to reveal a young black lieutenant, her uniform crisp, her posture perfect, but her eyes wide with nervousness. She couldn't have been more than 25, Ava thought. About the same age Ava had been when she first enlisted. "General Coleman," the lieutenant said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Lieutenant Daniels. I just wanted to say." She swallowed hard, her Adam's apple bobbing. "What they did to you wasn't right." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their truth. Ava studied the young woman's face, the determined set of her jaw, the faint tremble in her lower lip, the fire in her eyes that hadn't yet been dimmed by years of bureaucracy and disappointment. She looked, Ava realized with a pang, exactly like she herself had looked decades ago. Ava smiled then, but it wasn't the bright, confident smile from her official portraits. This smile was smaller, sadder, wiser. "No, Lieutenant," Ava said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "It wasn't." The lieutenant opened her mouth as if to say more, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she snapped to attention and rendered one final, perfect salute. Ava returned it automatically, her body moving from muscle memory even as her heart ached. As the lieutenant turned to leave, Ava called after her. "Daniels?" The young officer paused in the doorway. "Yes, General? Keep your head up. And your medals polished." The lieutenant's eyes gleamed with unshed tears as she nodded once before disappearing down the hallway. Alone again, Ava returned to her packing. The process should have taken hours, but she found herself moving faster now, as if staying any longer would be too painful. She left the framed photos for last: the graduation from West Point, the promotion ceremonies, the candid shots with her unit in various deserts and mountains across the world. Each one told a story of sacrifice, of perseverance, of a life dedicated to service. When everything was packed except for one small box of personal items, Ava took a final look around the office. The walls, once covered in maps and commendations, now showed only faint outlines where frames had hung. The bookshelves stood empty. The computer had been wiped clean. It was as if General Ava Coleman had never been here at all. She picked up the box, heavier than it looked, and walked to the door. Before turning off the light, she allowed herself one last moment, one final look at the place where she'd planned strategies, counseled young officers, and dreamed of making the military better for those who came after her. Then she flipped the switch. The hallway outside was conspicuously empty. No farewell party. No handshakes from colleagues. Just the quiet hum of the Pentagon going about its business, as if nothing had changed. Ava walked with her head high, the box in her arms, past offices where people deliberately didn't look up as she passed. At the security checkpoint, the guard, a grizzled sergeant who'd been there for decades, hesitated before taking her ID for the last time. "General?" he began, then stopped, clearly unsure what to say. Ava saved him the trouble. "Just MS Coleman now, Sergeant." The man's face twisted as if he'd tasted something bitter, but he nodded and handed back the civilian ID that had been issued to her that morning. "Good luck, ma'am," he muttered. And just like that, with a swipe of a badge and a walk through a turnstile, General Ava Coleman's military career was over. The sunlight outside was blinding after the fluorescent lights of the Pentagon. Reporters had been camped out for weeks waiting for this moment, but today, miraculously, the plaza was empty. Just a few pigeons pecking at the concrete and a hot wind stirring up dust devils. Ava stood for a long moment on the steps, the weight of her box digging into her arms, the unfamiliar civilian clothes itching at her skin. Somewhere behind her, in those hallowed halls, her portrait would eventually be hung in the gallery of former generals. Somewhere in a storage room, her records would be filed away. And somewhere out in the world, young officers like Lieutenant Daniels would carry on the fight, hopefully with more fairness than she'd been shown. She adjusted her grip on the box and started down the steps, one foot in front of the other. Just like basic training. Just like combat.
just like life.
The metal in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step. 1 year later, the world had moved on. Judge William Harkness still presided over his courtroom with the same iron grip, his reputation untouched by the brief media storm. If anything, his standing in legal circles had grown stronger, hailed as a defender of judicial authority. He never spoke Ava Coleman's name publicly again. At the Pentagon, new generals filled old offices. The administrative review of Ava's record was quietly closed with no findings of wrongdoing, but the damage had been done. The official story became one of mutual separation, as if a 4-star general would simply choose to walk away at the height of her career. Younger officers learned the unspoken lesson: follow orders, even the unjust ones, or face the consequences. The media found new scandals to dissect. The talking heads who had screamed about Ava's case now screamed about other things. Her name became a trivia question. Who was the first black female 4-star general? Asked occasionally on game shows between questions about pop stars and sports figures. But in quiet corners of the military, the story lived on. Lieutenant Daniels kept a folded newspaper clipping about General Coleman in her locker. She showed it to other young black officers when no one was looking. "Remember this," she would say. "Remember her." At veterans gatherings, old soldiers who had served with Ava would raise their glasses when her name was mentioned. No speeches. No toasts. Just the clink of glass and knowing nods. Ava herself had moved to a small town near the Canadian border, where she volunteered at a veterans center and occasionally taught history at the local community college. Students often remarked about the Distinguished Service Cross she wore on special occasions, the same one she'd refused to remove that day in court. When asked about it, she would simply say, "That's a story for another time." The system continued as it always had. New recruits joined up full of ideals. Old soldiers retired with mixed feelings. Policies changed slowly, if at all. But sometimes, on particularly cold nights, when the wind howled across the lake near her home, Ava would take out her metal and polish it carefully with a soft cloth. The silver still gleamed as brightly as it had that day in the courtroom. And in that reflection, if she looked hard enough, she could still see the faces of all the soldiers she'd served with, the living and the dead nodding their approval.